Hello. Believe it or not, this is part 4 of lecture 1, the last part. I've broken it up because I've constructed it in small pieces, relatively small, to make one long lecture. I hope it's also more digestible. Okay, this one will be the shortest of all of the parts. I'm going to just discuss an approach which I will often be taking in discussing social problems, but I may not explicitly identify as using this approach. The approach is critical constructionism. So I'm just going to have a brief lecture about the basic concepts that support this point of view. So at this point, I should say also, I have not got the this presentation in the form of a PDF finalized yet. So at this point, don't count on there being a PDF, a full PDF that contains everything I'm going to say in this lecture and everything that's going to be on the exam. I will tell you in this lecture if something is likely to be on the exam, though. So take notes from this lecture. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen, and oddly, I'll be sharing the screen, but okay. The social problems process, social constructionism, and critical constructionism. Often when we think about social problems, we tend to think, well, it's a condition that affects a significant number of people and it's something bad. It's bad. It adversely limits their quality of life. It is inequitable, unjust, morally wrong, something along those lines. So we're referencing value judgments. We're referencing our moral codes, our sense of right and wrong. Now, moral codes have varied considerably over the course of history. What's considered right, wrong, appropriate, borderline, etc. Child labor was considered no big deal for most of human history. Of course, before the Industrial Revolution, most people were farmers and needed the whole family working, usually at certain times of the year, to bring in the harvest. So also these what's considered right, wrong, bad, good, appropriate, inappropriate varies across cultures around the world. There are practices in some cultures which Americans would find abhorrent. But if you take the standpoint of cultural relativism, you need to step outside your own particular moral reaction to some of these processes in order to study them objectively. Now, because sociology aims at being scientific in the study of social problems, attempts to be a scientific and therefore objective account of the nature, causes, possible solutions for social problems. We need to deliberately try to think apart from these value judgments which most people associate with social problems. That's not to say that sociology is free of value judgments. Typically, though, they're able to identify them within, often, the particular solution that's advocated for a problem is definitely going to involve some value. For instance, equality is a value, an ideal that is embedded in our Constitution and has not really been the reality for most of our nation's history and is not now, for that matter. So they are still there, but there are ways of defining social problems that allow you to be objective. Objective is more or less the opposite of being subjective. Subjective assessment is from your own point of view. You're not relying on necessarily on some observations of what's actually going on. You just kind of pull it out of the air, out of your own predispositions and ways of thinking, what you've been taught perhaps. Objectivity, again, it's something which is probably ultimately unachievable, but it is intended, ideally it would be a neutral assessment based upon observations of what is actually happening, and anyone could observe the phenomenon and would see the same things. So objectivity is really just kind of intersubjective agreement, but objectivity is the gold standard of scientific work. So I need to pause the recording here for just 1 second. Well, I don't see. Never mind. I'll continue. You're hearing my cat in the background. So let's move on. This social problems perspective. What one can observe when looking at a social problem and the whole process that constructing a social problem entails, you see that a significant number of people feels that some condition needs to be eliminated or reduced, for usually they will advance value judgments to justify that. And often these value judgments are rooted in moral codes, religious doctrines, ultimately perhaps, but not always. Sometimes you can't really totally free yourself from the moral judgments, but you can make an observation that there's a significant number of people who have organized, mobilized to effect a change in some condition that the individuals that are affected by it cannot do on an individual basis. It has to be a collective activity. So you can observe that, is the movement big enough? Are there social movement organizations established? Is the media covering the organization, the movement to affect a change? And Joel Best, I have an advanced copy of a book which will formally be published next year on social problems. And the book is not a typical social problems book. It's about the social problems process. And in the course of providing many examples of this process, he covers many social problems. So this is the basic model for this process. At the beginning, you have something called claims making. That's just people who make claims, who say things. For instance, this is the example here. He's using a racial discrimination, segregation. So people make claims that there is a problem. In this case, the example is Martin Luther King organizing, speaking, writing, calling for an end to segregation in all its forms. The Montgomery bus boycott boycott of the bus system was one of the first actions of the civil rights movement, as we've come to call it, that began in the 1950s. And basically, it took place in the South for the most part, although segregation certainly existed and does exist outside of the South. It's just in the South, it was legal segregation. It was part of the legal code. So, okay, media covers. Media is very important in establishing that a social problem exists. Other people will hear about it. They can think about it, make a judgment about it. Eventually, there'll be a significant number of the members of the public that have reacted to it and may give support or oppose the movement. So again, the examples: media coverage, newspaper, television coverage of the civil rights campaign. I was growing up when this was going on and watched the news from a very early age, because that was something I did with my father. I think he was a high school teacher, history teacher, and you know, it left a pretty powerful impression on me. So in any case, so if enough people become concerned about the problem and think something should be done, they may write to their congresspersons, the senators, to the president. They may march in solidarity with people and become part of the movement. So eventually, if it's ideally, the process would lead to some change in official policy, government policy, because as I said, social problems by their nature can't be solved by individuals, have to be solved collectively. Typically, this means the government acting in the interests of others, of their citizens. Doesn't always have to mean that, of course. You know, the government can sometimes be an obstacle, quite often, I shouldn't say sometimes. So Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, Voting Rights Act in 65. Then we reached the stage of social problems work, where the agencies are implementing the new policies. They're also starting to measure how well the policies are working. So what they're looking at that point is policy outcomes. How has the new policy worked? Are people, have the barriers for African Americans voting in the South fallen, or are there still obstacles to prevent them from exercising their constitutional right to vote? Often that feeds back into policy making. The policy has to be modified. And this is a very simplified diagram. In reality, there's a lot of feedback throughout this. But what we see here, particularly with someone making the claim, and the media coverage is the beginning of the construction of a social problem, because they are not objectively out there. We may think that they are, but the example I gave of child labor, many other things as well, there are multiple examples of this sort of thing. So one example I came across in my reading is, we know that there is significant discrimination on the basis of race in hiring, and also on gender, particularly when it comes to salary, perhaps not hiring. So, and both of those conditions led to social movements which ended up affecting some change. There's still more to be done in both those regards, but another type of discrimination in hiring particularly involves height, how tall someone is. You may not have known this, but taller people tend to get hired for, if several people are interviewing, equally qualified for a particular upper level job, a managerial job, for instance, executive job, just about any job. Studies have shown that the tallest person tends to be the one hired. Now, this is holding other factors constant. So this might be just, for instance, if all three people are white males, you would hire the tallest of them. There are other types of discrimination, as we know, on the basis of race and gender, that have outcomes on people's lives. So, but nobody has constructed height heightism as a social problem at this point. It could happen, I suppose, but it hasn't happened yet. So moving on. So for the test, know what claims making refers to. That is the first step in constructing a social problem in the social problems process. And be aware of what social problems work means. Okay. I'm pretty sure I introduced the notion of social construction of reality, social reality, in one of the first parts of this long lecture, this introductory lecture. By the way, this lecture is intended to provide you with the tools for dealing with the rest of the course. Tools you can apply to analyzing and understanding the social problems we're discussing. So, a lot of this comes of the concept of social constructionism is sort of borrowed from philosophy, but the symbolic interactionist theorists, which you should know about by now, have been instrumental in developing this perspective. So they pointed out that, as I've already said, moral codes vary across time and space. And most sociologists today who think about social problems of any sort would say they are socially constructed. They're not obvious. An example, a couple of examples. One local. When I worked for Harris County Pollution Control in Pasadena for 8 years. Excuse me, 6 years. And if you've been to Pasadena or been around an area of Texas City or Melby Park or Beaumont, where there are a lot of chemical plants, you may notice a peculiar, unpleasant odor that you don't notice in most other cities or parts of town. Pasadena smells worse than River Oaks from all of the air pollution from the plants. Now, the Clean Air Act was passed in, I think, 1970 to address these problems. The environmental movement took shape in the late 60s and in 1970, particularly with the first Earth Day, which we still have Earth Days. There's still a strong environmental movement. People's concern with environmental problems seems to ebb and flow with the economy. When the economy is a concern, it kind of moves a few notches down in importance in most polls. But the old timers over in Pasadena used to call that smell of air pollution the smell of money. It was making money for people, providing jobs. So it wasn't something which really it was just a nuisance, really, not an environmental problem that needed to be fixed. The same is true. The Victorians in England during the Industrial Revolution would go to the new cities like Birmingham and Manchester where the factory system and the mass production using coal to run machinery was developing very rapidly, and every bit of the city would be coated with coal dust. The air was terrible, the water was terrible, but people going from London to take a look at that, they just thought, my, this is wonderful. Look at all this progress, this industry, but the actual conditions under which people were working were unhealthful. It was damaging to the overall environment, but it was seen as a sign of progress and not a social problem. Finally, for an example which will be mentioned on the exam, if you've studied the section on sociological theories, you know about the functionalists, and you've heard about Emile Durkheim. Durkheim thought crime was functional. It was good. Okay, we don't usually tend to think of crime as something positive. he believed it was because it reinforces the moral boundaries, so to speak. It unifies people by reminding them of the rules of the group and how far one can go with to avoid punishment. And 150, 200 years ago and before, punishment for a crime tended to involve your body. Something was done to your body, and it was done in a very public manner in many cases. So people would be drawn to that. So crime for Durkheim was good. It was a necessary thing. Now that point of view is kind of alien to the way we think. Additionally, regarding crime, we will see something else in just a moment. We'll stick with crime here. So not only are the media very important in social construction, but for many problems, the role of the expert, someone who knows a lot about a subject, is critical. We're still seeing the battle. It's amazing that it continues about whether or not climate change is real. There is an industry. The Heartland Institute was the primary think tank that would provide experts with some sort of technical knowledge to counter the claims that climate change was real and it was caused by human activities. There weren't that many of them, but because many of the news outlets, the television news, feel they had to be fair, they had to give equal time to two points of view, even if 10,000 scientists supported had a different point of view than each one of the people who said climate change was not real. It didn't matter. You didn't look at the numbers. It was just 2 points of view. So the climate deniers got and still get more airtime than their numbers would suggest they deserve. Oddly, the same methods were used for many years to convince lawmakers, the government, people who regulate products, remove unhealthy products from circulation, to convince them that cigarettes were harmless. And they had a lot of scientific research to back up that claim, and they succeeded for quite a while. Eventually, of course, that all collapsed, but they tend to use the same techniques to oppose things. So experts are important on both sides of the issues. Symbolic interactionists, as I mentioned, are really at the heart of social constructionism. Basically, they believe that human beings, unlike animals, communicate using symbols. And their symbols are not only, obviously language is the primary symbolic system that we use, but it can be architectural as well. It can, as we know from the battle over Confederate monuments, those are lumps of stone. They're not human, but they have a symbolic meaning. They say things to people. Okay, but the meaning of symbols is not inherent in languages or architecture. People assign meanings to them, and these meanings can change. How do they get, where do the meanings come from? Well, they come from people agreeing on a meaning, from human interaction. The same is true for moral codes. They may have their source in a religious text, but if people don't agree that these codes should be the basis of laws, then they probably are not going to be. So someone has to make the case that a particular behavior or condition should be against the law, for instance, or at least seriously frowned upon. Maybe you wouldn't be jailed, you would be exiled from the community, depending upon the severity. What Howard Becker, who wrote a famous study of deviance, which is crime is a subset of deviance. Crime is just deviance that violates the law rather than people's sense of what's appropriate or yes, appropriate is a good enough word. What's allowable. So whether something becomes illegal and the extent to which people are punished depends in many ways on who is harmed and who is doing the harming. And when you come down to it, you find power has a lot to do with it. Usually people with more power are making the rules that apply mostly, but not exclusively, to people with less power. And this power differential is where we get into critical constructionism, which I will get to in the next slide. But you need to remember that to say something socially constructed doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, you should have encountered the Thomas theorem early on. It said what is believed to be real has real consequences. There's a lot of research on health effects of someone perceiving they have been discriminated against. Now, by saying perceiving, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's in other words, if a person believes that something is affecting them, then their body may reflect this in the form of higher blood pressure, greater likelihood to seek treatment for depression or anxiety. So critical constructionism, which is sort of the approach I will take, is derived from critical theory, which is a type of conflict theory, and it's heavily indebted to the writings of Marx and people who took his basic assumptions and expanded upon them. But the focus there is on how these differences in resources, power, wealth, etc., between groups, what role do they play in establishing these codes that set the boundaries? Like on this side of the line, behavior on this side of the line is unjust, it's immoral, or in this situation, someone is not being treated equally, they're not being given their rights. How are those boundaries drawn? Well, they're drawn by the more powerful members of society. As an example, going back to crime, soon you will learn, if you don't already know about it, about white collar crime, the kind of crime that tends to be committed by corporations. Pollution could be considered a form of white collar crime if it's done in a sneaky manner, like it was in a few cases during Hurricane Harvey, where plants took the opportunity to dump all of their hazardous waste into the floodwaters. A plant, I should say. So now, typically, the penalties for white collar crime are not nearly as severe as they would be for street crime, or just for shoplifting, even in some cases. Often there's just a huge fine. Corporations, they say, are people, but you can't put a corporation in jail. You can do more time stealing $50 than 50 million if you are just a student, let's say, who's taken $50, pardon me, versus someone like Jeff Skilling at Enron that defrauded people and took actions that actually led to people's deaths. And he got a stiff sentence, really, it was probably one of the harsher handed out in recent memory for a crime of that nature. But the differences in penalties, and you also see this in the war on drugs. the media and some certain claims makers created the crack problem, in a sense. I'm not saying that there wasn't a problem with crack. It is an addictive drug, and many people were becoming enslaved to it, but it led to the development of mandatory minimum sentences for certain quantities of crack cocaine. Now, crack is, as you know, just a form of cocaine, but these sentences for powdered cocaine, which tended to be used more by white drug users, weren't as severe for the same quantity of basically the same drug. Now, crack is changed so that it can be smoked, whereas powdered cocaine cannot be smoked directly, sniffed, or injected. But finally, it took quite some time before that inequity in sentencing, which led to more African Americans in jail for longer periods of time for basically the same offense than a white American would get for having an equivalent drug, just a slightly different formulation. It took a while to get that changed. It has been changed now, so the penalties are equivalent, but I don't really recall who would have been the initial claims makers. Probably police agencies, perhaps, and conservative outlets of one sort or another, but also people in the communities that saw what was happening would have been involved in it. Now, they certainly, in the beginning, would not, if they were in the community, probably not advocating making the sentences harsher for people that look like them than for the people the dominant elite of the United States, most of whom are white and male. That wouldn't have been one of their goals. There's also the concept I will mention. So remember, for an example of critical constructionism, how they would approach crime. Think of Durkheim. Crime is good. It's not something negative, and that connects more with social constructionism in general, and the difference in sentencing for white-collar criminals and street criminals who may have taken the much different amount of, get sentences that are lopsided compared to the harm that they may have caused, the number of people harmed, and also the crack versus powder cocaine inequity, which has been changed. But in any case, so back to critical theory. Now, why this is called critical constructionism? It's a critical theory approach to social problems that also accepts the social constructionism developed by the symbolic interactionists primarily in order to study social problems. It's called critical because the theorists are criticizing the status quo, the way the world is now, the social institutions and processes that make up the world around us. A formal criticism in this academic sense is often called a critique, to kind of give, I guess it puts it a notch above just complaining about something, just criticizing, because that has a negative connotation. Critique is not necessarily negative. And the goal typically of critical theory, deriving from Marx again, is human liberation or human emancipation, freeing us from all those things that have developed historically and continue to hold us back from achieving our true potential. For the critical theorists, the thing that people want is happiness, and to be happy, you have to have your material needs met. They would argue that we have the ability to meet everyone on the needs of everyone on the planet. There's enough food, there's enough machinery to make it, and resources to make enough clothing and shelter and all these things, but yet it doesn't happen. So critical theorists see a future where we are freed from a lot of the deprivation and misery that most of us at one time or another in our lives, if not our entire life, will experience. There are several types of critical theory too that I'll just mention now, because I don't think I mentioned it in the section on theory, and you should write down some of these because there will be a question about that. So, as I said, it derived from Marx. The first group that I'm aware of to have the critical theory label applied to them, partly because they used it, had it in the titles of their books, was a group of Jewish Marxist, I guess, emigres, you could say, refugees from Nazi Germany, who came to the United States and to London and elsewhere and wrote. Two of the famous ones that landed in California were Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Wrote a very influential book still called The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which had a chapter on something they called the culture industry. Actually, Adorno wrote most of that chapter. So if you may encounter that if you're studying more liberal arts or even art history, something along those lines. You tend to find more Marxists in the humanities now than in the social sciences, but in any case, this group from Germany, they worked at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. So they became known as the Frankfurt School, and they were very influential, particularly Herbert Marcuse, who was another one that he went to UC Santa Barbara, I believe, and stayed in the United States. Adorno and Horkheimer, several others, went back to Germany after the war. Marcuse stayed and was a big influence on what was called the New Left, the student movement against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and early 70s. So Frankfurt School, critical theory, but also we have critical race theory. I was shocked to hear Donald Trump mention critical race theory, condemned it, of course, as out on the campaign trail. But critical race theory has been around for a while. Queer theory is another form of critical theory, basically, and most feminist theory falls under the heading of critical theory. And there are other, you can take a critical approach to just about any social problem and situation. There's critical environmental sociology, for instance. There's constructionist environmental sociology, and the two are not necessarily the same thing. So anyway, so I just mentioned 4 variants of critical theory: Frankfurt School, critical race theory, feminist theory, and queer theory. So that's where the term critical comes from, and critical constructionism. And with that, that is all. So I will be recording a review for the exam shortly. I guess there's been some confusion about the lockdown browser quiz and the information about the exam, which you will find if you look at the syllabus link for August 31st, syllabus link in Canvas. You will find information about the first exam. it has to be taken with the lockdown browser. So I'll go over that more when I record the review for the exam. Bye.